Hi everybody, my name is Terry Nelson. I live in Dover. This book I'll explain the genesis of this book. This is sort of part of it. As I mentioned to some of you, believe it or not, Tom Brady and Bill Belichick know or have seen this. Let's put it this way. Allen Park was where the Patriots went to do joint practices with the Lions this summer. Matt Patricia being with the Lions, they organized some joint practices. This 80-foot tire is along I-94 west of Detroit. I grew up in Michigan. I moved to New Hampshire 15 years ago with my wife. This is on the way toward the Metropolitan Airport or Ann Arbor or Kalamazoo or Chicago, so I've passed by it hundreds of times growing up and as an adult. And it wasn't for a while that I thought about, what is this thing? What's the story behind this? And like a lot of you, I think you'd like to know the story, the historical stories behind it. So I finally did some digging around, and this is what it turns out to be. This was a Ferris wheel at the 1964 World's Fair in New York. And so I don't know if anybody's been to that. I've been to a few presentations where people had, did you ride on that Ferris wheel?
No, but I was there. I don't remember the tire though.
Yeah, it looks like, I don't know Queens, and I don't know what highway that is, but it's right on the edge of the fair. But anyway, that was something I wanted to find out what was the deal with this 80-foot tire. It had to be something, and so I did a little digging around, and it turned out to be this. And that's the kind of thing that intrigues me, and I think that's the kind of thing that intrigues a lot of folks. So, as I said, I'm originally from Michigan. My background was in education. I was a teacher in Michigan for many years, and then moved to New Hampshire, and my wife became a teacher in Epsom, and my last job was as an assistant principal at Southside Middle School in Manchester. But when I first moved to New Hampshire, I got a job with Granite State College as a consultant, special ed consultant, and part of that job was I had almost like a salesperson. I had a territory of schools that I covered to provide professional development. In doing so, I was able to wander around the state a lot, take back roads there and back, and the nice thing about being a consultant like that, I wasn't on a 9-to-5 schedule. I would go to school, give a presentation, and go home or go somewhere else. So I got to run across a lot of interesting things, and I started thinking these might make good subjects for a book. So these are the 10 chapters. The towns, first one, Dr. Dearborn, is in Nottingham. London Bridge is in Windham. Little Boar's Head is a section of Northampton. Meeting House at Dover Point, obviously in Dover. Broth Hill, City of Seth, is here. New Hampshire's Central Park is mostly in Somersworth, a little bit in Dover. Dover Speedway at Granite State Park, which is nearby Central Park, was mostly in Somersworth, a little bit in Dover. Atkinson Academy, I believe, and I don't have time to talk about it tonight. If anybody knows Atkinson Academy, has anybody seen it or been down there? It's tucked away in Atkinson, and it's on a road that only stretches for 2 miles. But I think it's the oldest school in the country. They rightly claim to be the oldest coeducational school that's still existing. But I did some research. I think it's flat out the oldest school in the country, still educating children. It was built in 1803. Town pounds. Something I hadn't heard of coming from Michigan. Part of that story starts here because Durham has the oldest town pound. And then the story of John Layton and Madbury, I also can't get to tonight, but it's a moving story of a young man in Madbury who took care of his family. Basically, they got better and he passed away. But it's a fascinating story. So these are some of the things as I wandered around the state, like London Bridge, Windham. When I was a consultant, I was assigned to work at Windham schools, and I learned about this bridge, which I will talk about tonight, and things of that nature. There's a Bruce Springsteen song, "From Small Things, Big Things One Day Come," and really the genesis of this book that really got me thinking what I wanted to write is from this little monument at Nottingham Square. Has anybody been up that way? It's just north of Pawtuckaway. Nottingham Square is a beautiful spot. That's a small monument to Henry Dearborn, a person I hadn't heard of, but as it turns out, there was a lot to his story. And in looking into Henry Dearborn in this monument, one day I finally pulled over and checked it out, and I read what it talks about, which is that General Henry Dearborn marched with 60 Minutemen from Nottingham Square to Bunker Hill in 12 hours, April 20, 1775. The second part, erected by the DAR in August 1905, that was important to me because it led me to think not only does this monument describe an important historical event, but the monument being put up there in 1905 is sort of historical in itself. And I started wondering what other backstories are there behind the main story. There are a few problems with this monument anybody might have caught. The first one is not quite so important. Instead of 12 hours, most historian thinks he marched from Nottingham Square to, the mustering point was in Cambridge, Mass, and it took about 20 hours. But even that's quite a feat because he had to gather, they got, on April 20th in the morning, they got what they called a Concord alarm. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, word spread, and that was April 19th. And so Dearborn, who had been working with a militia that he had raised from the time he moved to Nottingham, and he moved there in 1772 and did set up a medical practice. His militiamen were from Epsom, Northwood, Deerfield, as well as Nottingham. So you can imagine it would take a while to get 60 guys together with muskets and equipment. They had to, then it's about 60 miles to Cambridge, so they left at 2 in the afternoon. They had to hot-foot it down the road to the river. They had to cross the Merrimack, and I think getting 60 men across the river probably took more than one ferry ride. They stopped for dinner, and then they went on to Cambridge to the mustering point. That leads to the other problem on this monument. Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill was in June of 1775, not in April. So this monument sort of conflated a whole bunch of things in telling the story. But as it turns out, Dearborn and his militia did participate in the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was the youngest, he was made a captain in the New Hampshire militia, the youngest person to do so. He's only 24. He fought with distinction at Bunker Hill. And so by thinking about this monument, even though it's slightly flawed in some of the facts, the main facts are correct, and it still doesn't diminish, to me, what was the incredible event of Dearborn taking these men and getting them down to ready for battle, even though they didn't engage on that day, overnight. And it was an amazing story, and I wanted to learn more. This is General Dearborn. He became a general during the Revolutionary War. I like this quote. This is from a book of his own writings. But eating part of fried rattlesnake, which would have tasted very well had it not been snake. That sort of reminds me of people who have frog legs for the first time. You know, it tastes like chicken until you eat it and you realize it's not what you thought. It's from his journals, which are probably the most complete journals of the Revolutionary War one can get. From 1775 to 1783, he pretty much made daily logs into a journal. It's been published many times, and it makes fascinating reading. This is one of the days from it. But what is interesting about this is July 7th, so he's out there eating rattlesnake. 2 days before, on July 5th, he was with several fellow officers at a tavern somewhere, having a fine meal, toasting what was then the 3rd anniversary of independence. 13 toasts, you know, having a great time, and yet 2 days later he's out foraging for rattlesnake. I mean, this is sort of what the soldiers who fought for our independence faced on a daily basis, and it just was amazing to me to read about him one day at a nice feast and having drinks, the next day eating rattlesnake. This is some excerpts from the journal. They're all in one period. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, at which he distinguished himself, he was tasked with, he mustered in Portland, and he had to do a 300-mile march up through Maine to Quebec to engage the British at Quebec City. He was meeting actually Benedict Arnold. But what's fascinating about this, I mean, you can see the underlying parts. It just talks about how the hardships that they had to face as they marched 300 miles, and then they had to go and engage in a battle in Quebec. And it's just amazing to think that every day, for example, they encountered just rain and rain and rain. It's an amazing another amazing accomplishment, and it's a fascinating little bit of what the day-to-day life of a soldier was like at that time. This is his birthplace. He was born in Northampton. It's his birthplace marker. It's beautifully kept to this day, as you can see. But this is a brief history. Set up his medical practice in 1772. 24, made an officer. Led the company at Bunker Hill. Fought with distinction at the Battle of Saratoga and Monmouth. He was there for with Washington when Cornwallis surrendered. He moved to Maine, which of course then was part of Massachusetts, and he became the first U.S. Marshal for the district. He was appointed Major General of the Maine Militia. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Secretary of War under Jefferson. I underlined that because it leads to a point a little bit later in the story. Major General in the War of 1812, Minister to Portugal, and then just for good measure, Augusta, Maine was named for his daughter, one of his daughters. So a very accomplished person, obviously, and quite a career just with that. This is the scene in Nottingham Square, which again is a beautiful little square. It's not little, it's probably pretty good size, several acres. This is where he would drill with his militia. It probably hasn't changed much since the days he was there. His house is no longer there, but many of the homes there that surround the square are still lived in by the families that lived in at that time. They still farm around there. Nottingham is known as the town of four generals: Bartlett, Scilly, Butler, and General Dearborn. They're rightly proud of that. This is a DAR chapter. And some of the backstories in my book also deal with organizations such as the Daughters of American Revolution, and later on you'll see Boy Scouts that do a lot to preserve and promote and protect our heritage. And this obviously is just promoting heritage in Nottingham, but the DAR in Nottingham has commemorated many historical points. The schoolhouse in the back on the right from 1850 is now owned by the DAR. They use the downstairs for the meetings, but upstairs is a museum of the school. And I was taken on a tour of it once, a couple of years ago, and in an anteroom in the school, off the main classroom, actually this is upstairs from where the classroom would be, I saw this graffiti on the wall. August 15th, 1852 afternoon, October 5th, 1854 afternoon, Mr. Littlefield's name down there, and then Isaiah and Matthew. And I thought at first Isaiah and Matthew were some naughty boys who had to go upstairs and do some lessons. But looking closer, those are Bible verses. And I read the verses, and as you can see at the bottom, they have to do with biblical misbehavior, the Lord's vengeance, and redemption. So certainly somebody was being naughty and had to go upstairs. And I'm guessing Mr. Littlefield wrote these Bible verses on the wall in pencil so that they could do their penance. But I think it's amazing that after now, 160 years, this graffiti is still there, and it's still in that building in Nottingham Square. You can see in the upper left corner, they've whitewashed right up to where that is. So that's obviously something they cherish there, and it's just a nice little like corner of history that is in this schoolhouse that can be seen if you make an appointment with the local DAR that owns it. But those are that obviously has nothing to do with Henry Dearborn, but those are the kind of fascinating things I ran across as I was doing my research and visiting places and just seeing, well, there's a lot of other backstories to the main story. As I mentioned, I'm originally from Michigan. This is the Dearborn headquarters of Ford Motor Company, and all of a sudden that little light bulb went on in my head. I said, Henry Dearborn, is he the Dearborn, Michigan guy? And you probably guessed the answer is yes. And also it turns out he also, and I've been to Chicago a lot, and there's a Dearborn Street, if you know Chicago, is a main north-south drag in Chicago. And same question to my mind, is that the same Dearborn person? And indeed it is. Dearborn, Michigan was named after Henry Dearborn by an officer who served under him in the War of 1812. The officer had been tasked to the fort at Detroit, and he had to build an armory in west of Detroit, and named it Dearbornville after Dearborn. The reason I put this picture up there is I think again, a backstory. I think most people would be surprised to know that Lincoln's Sheriff from Ford's Theater is in Dearborn, Michigan, at the Henry Ford Museum. Has anybody been to this museum? It's outstanding. It's like the Smithsonian. It's huge. It's 14 acres under one roof. I mean, if anybody could build something as big as a factory, Henry Ford could. And so there's airplanes hanging from the building. There's entire trains inside, obviously a lot of cars, and many, many other amazing things, including Lincoln's chair. But unlike Dearborn, which is named after Henry Dearborn, city of Chicago is a different story. As I mentioned before, Dearborn was the Secretary of War under Jefferson. And when Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory in 1803, he tasked his Secretary of War to find a communications base for the vast new territories that we had just acquired. So Dearborn commissioned some officers and some scouts to head out west and find a suitable place for a fort. They settled on an area where modern Chicago is now. So while Henry Dearborn didn't found Chicago, there had been fishermen living there in small villages. He pretty much made it happen in that he commissioned the fort to be built there. And when forts are built, soldiers move in, families sometimes move in with them, citizens come around, move in around the outside, build homes for safety and for trade, and out of that cities grow, and in this case the city of Chicago. So he really formed the nucleus of modern Chicago. So much so that, as you can see, there's Uncle Sam, John Bull, and Father Knickerbocker, which I didn't know that was actually how the Knicks got their name, but that's Father Knickerbocker of New York. Chicago is personified by a character named Father Dearborn. And this is an old Chicago Tribune cartoon made by the guy who created Gasoline Alley, Frank King. And you can see on the bottom of his coat, Father Dearborn, he's confronting the Illinois Central Railroad over air pollution, and obviously things haven't changed a lot. The Illinois Central is pretty much blowing him off, pretty literally. But it's a good example of how Dearborn was a personification of the city of Chicago. On top of that, the quote at the top is from Edward Everett Hale in a magazine. He's the gentleman who wrote The Man Without a Country. No wagon of four wheels for pleasure traveling was known until General Dearborn introduced such a wagon from the west in the period of the English War, that meaning the War of 1812. This is a Dearborn wagon, which I hadn't heard the name, but I've seen this often enough in old Gunsmoke episodes and movies with John Wayne. This is probably the most ubiquitous mode of travel from about 1820 to 1910. It was lightweight, it was versatile, and Henry Dearborn, although he's not said to have invented it, nobody really knows who invented this wagon. He's credited with popularizing it by bringing it back east, and from there they were manufactured and spread throughout the land. This one, as you can see, is at a fort in Colorado. This is a replica. There were very few images left of Dearborn's, and so they had one built, but that's a pretty good representation. I did manage to find a photograph from 1868 of this photographer named Timothy O'Sullivan. His Dearborn wagon he's using it as a darkroom in Nevada in 1868. So you can see the versatility. He could carry his darkroom with him in this wagon. He could take his pictures, he could go in and develop them and go in and take some more pictures. So from that little monument, all these stories about Dearborn, about the Dearborn wagon, about the founding of Chicago, all came because of that, and that sort of informs how not only that little monument reminded me of the Bruce Springsteen song, but also the kind of things I was looking for in my book. Closer to home, my wife and I often drive down Route 108 as we're heading to Stratham to get our cars fixed, or to Exeter or places beyond. And I drove by these homes several times, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these. And I kept thinking, they're all pretty similar. They all pretty much share the same footprint. Does anybody live in one of these, by the way? I want to make sure. So, as it turns out, these are shipwrights' homes built in 1800 on Broth Hill, which is derived from the Colbroth family name, and these are on Route 108. And the map over here from 1871, it's probably hard to tell, but here are the homes right down here. There's the bridge. Right up here is the old town hall, which actually James Coe built. And then actually we're going to talk about it later. The town pound is right there, the crook in the road. So these are the kind of things that fascinate me as I'm driving around. By the way, if anybody has any questions or comments, just go ahead and sing them out as we go along. I had to find out what they were. I've got another, there's 5 homes that are identical. The one here is actually older. It's a 1761 cobbler's cottage, but then the other 4, they're hard to see, but there's 1, 2, 3, and here's 4, are the homes that James Coe built for his ship workers. A book called Landmarks in Ancient Dover by Mary P. Thompson, written in 1892, had this strange little poem in it. Broth Hill, the city of Seth, were not for Joe Coe, they would all starve to death. I have no idea what they're talking about in that, other than maybe the fact that he built homes for his ship workers kept these gentlemen from starving to death. Seth is Seth, I believe his name is Seth Walker, who owned a tavern in the 17th century in that area, and somehow that area became known as the city of Seth. He probably served really good beer. I don't know what else. But there's a picture of Joseph Coe. The resolution, unfortunately, is not good enough to put in my book, and that's the only picture I could find of him, but he was an entrepreneur, political activist, and a shipbuilder. He left actually a pretty big imprint on town. This is a picture from a 1913 history of Durham. I don't know if many of you have seen this. The bridge on the far left would be where the dam is behind, and down the road would be the Coe homes and also the town pound. But you can see shipbuilding activity, and that's why I included this. You can see a completed ship with the mast, and then to the left of it, you can see a couple ships still in the state of being built. And that looks to me like that's where 4 Chimneys is on the top. Does that look right to everybody?
Yeah, the 3 chimneys.
The 3 Chimneys, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that gives an idea of the shipbuilding industry. I think there was something like 75 ships were built in Durham at that time. Coe was also, again, as politically very active. He wrote a book which is still in print on 2 continents. The top one is from the US, and the bottom one I think is the UK edition. And he was very patriotic. This would probably be a good example, is the first inaugural addresses of all the presidents from 1789 to 1839, Declaration of Independence, things like that, farewell addresses, and address to the young men of the country. So he was very prolific, very active. He was obviously a very good businessman. He was a Democrat, and you'll find out later on that I'm going to be bipartisan here. I've got a Republican connected to the story as well. He was an ardent ardent abolitionist, as was the other gentleman I'm going to talk about. A little bit digression here, but the original idea when I saw those 4 shipbuilders' homes, I was doing, my book originally encompassed more than just the seacoast, and I was looking for unusual workers' homes. We all pretty much are familiar with the row houses and that are go with the big factories in the big towns, and I was looking at odd little workers' homes. The ones up in the upper right, Grenier Heights, those homes still exist. They were built for Air Force families during World War II when Grenier Field became a major air base for the Army Air Corps. And what's interesting about those homes is that they were built to a pattern that, believe it or not, was the pattern for Levittown in New York. Just because of the theory of manufacture, or the theory of building homes for small sites. That's Willow Street between the homes and between the drive-in. On the upper left would be Memorial High School, and to the right upper would be where the Mall of New Hampshire is. The other homes that were part of the story were the Chase family homes in Manchester. This was a gentleman named Edward Chase, furniture owner, who was, had a kind of a social engineering project where these homes were built for working people who could basically rent to own. And he wanted working people to have nice middle-class type homes. So these are two stories. Unfortunately, they had to be left on the cutting room floor, but it did lead to me having to delve deeper into the chapter about Broth Hill, and it leads me to Henry Wilson. He's New Hampshire's the only vice president of the U.S. born in New Hampshire, but he was born Jeremiah Jones Colbath. Remember, that's the name that Broth Hill was named after. And I heard about him in that same book that Mary Thompson wrote. She just happened to mention when she's talking about Broth Hill that Henry Wilson was of that family. Henry Wilson's story is fascinating, though, because he hated his name so much, because his father was basically an idiot, that when he was 18, he changed it to Henry Wilson. He eventually left New Hampshire, went to Massachusetts, owned a shoe factory. He became a senator, and then he ran on the ticket with the U.S. grant in 1872 and became vice president. Unfortunately, he died in office, but he was Republican. He was also strongly anti-slavery. According to Mark Hatfield, if you remember that senator, he wrote a book about vice presidents. And Henry Wilson's greatest accomplishment, he felt, was writing the law that banned slavery in the District of Columbia. So again, another backstory. I'm trying to find out about the houses on Broth Hill, and I went across Henry Wilson, New Hampshire's only vice president. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is Joseph Coe's store, built in 1825. It's a powerful statement in that in 1825 there weren't a lot of brick stores being built. It's at the nexus of there's the road to Dover on the left and the road to Exeter on the right, and behind, not too far, are the docks. So he would have the docks, the goods from the docks, there's a store, and folks would come and trade at his store and move on from there. So he was quite an amazing guy. He had a lot to do, really, with early Dover history and the making, Durham history and the making of Durham. Now it's the Parks and Recs Department on the bottom floor, and the top floor is the Historical Society's museum and offices. There used to be the town hall. Different story, Dover Speedway at Granite State Park. This is sort of what I call a story of a ghost racetrack. Racetracks that used to be but aren't in existence anymore. I like this picture for a lot of reasons. Mostly there's the flagman in white about 2 feet away from the cars, but notice also the front wheels on all the front left wheels on all the cars are smaller. That's because it's such a small oval, a fifth of a mile, only 1,000 feet, that they're basically turning left the whole way. The racetrack originally was called Granite State Park. It was originally a horse racing track. It's here. This is Will End Pond here, and here's Dover down here, Rollinsford, Somersworth up here, and this track. This is from a 1918 map of Stratford County, but maps show a racetrack there since 1856. I'm going to talk a little bit later. On the other side of Will End Pond, there's Central Park, and we're going to talk about that in a little while as well. A little bit of aerial archaeology, and there's a 1953 image this is a U.S. Air Force photo of the track. Here's that little 1/5 mile oval, and you can almost see the banking there. This is a 1 mile racetrack, and here's a 1/2 mile racetrack, as well. Here's what it looks like today. You can still see the outline of the track like that. There's the 1/5 mile. Here's the 1/2 mile track. It's been encroached upon already by an apartment project. This land is for sale. So eventually this is all going to be gone, like Rockingham is gone. And so that's why it's sort of called a ghost racetrack. It's not obviously used. The last car race of any kind was held there in 1965. But it's still there, it can still be seen. There's still asphalt on the 1/5 mile, still sections of asphalt left, and a few other remnants as well, as you can see. In 1858, the state fair moved to Dover. It had traveled around before that. I think the first state fair was 1851. It moved from Manchester to Meredith, and they settled in 1858 to bring it to Dover. You can see on the left side, on the bottom, events to be held at Granite State Trotting Park, which is the original name for that 1 mile racetrack. Notice also on this right here, there's what they call the order of arrangement, basically the events for the week. Wednesday, the first day of the fair, there's an interesting one that is kind of hard to read there, but I'll blow it up for you to read, and I'll just let you read it to yourself to find out, see what's available. So yes, I thought maybe 1858 was more fun than we ever thought, because of promiscuous driving under the direction of the marshals, whatever that means. But what it really means, unfortunately, is that at that time, promiscuous driving meant you could take your rig out on the track and drive around as long as you didn't do anything bad. So it's just open driving on the racetrack. In 1859, racing started there at Granite State Park. It was what they call match race. It's harness racing, and at that time it was what they called match races, just two ponies racing against each other for a purse, and there could be betting. And so that thus began in 1859 a tradition of racing at that little corner of Willen Pond. In 1894, I believe, or in the 1890s, Frank King, king of the ale makers, can't go wrong with a nickname like that, he bought the racetrack from Stratford County and turned it into a first-class commercial racetrack. He built stables for 300 horses. He built water towers for water. He built a hotel. You can see he's built grandstands. It became quite a destination. What I like about this picture from 1898, I've been to the track enough to know that normally the horses aren't on the rail watching the racing going on. And so I thought, obviously they were allowed to check out the competition as well. Frank Jones did many things, but in terms of horsemanship, he also bred horses. He was a reinsman, which is what you call the gentleman who drives I guess it's a sulky for harness races, and he was a track owner. This is what his brewery looked like. It was at one time the biggest brewery in New England. Parts of it still remain. On the left, the tall building that says brewery on it is still part of a development called, I think, the Frank Jones Brew Yard off of Lafayette in Portsmouth, and now it's residential and commercial. But this is the extent of what his brewery was like. This is a great postcard from 1880 from the Boston Public Library. I like also on the train that the artist decided to put the brakeman walking across the top of the boxcar. And it really wasn't necessary, but I guess the artists like to have fun with his pictures. Here's another view of the track. This is from a 1940 War Department photo, and you can see all that's here. There's the 1 mile oval. You can barely see the half-mile oval that was there. The auto racetrack hadn't been built yet. Later on, when I talk about Central Park, I'll point out this is a baseball field, and right here is a trolley car barn, which all of us can still go and enjoy today. This is the back straight. I just took this picture a year or two ago of the horse racetrack. It's right here. So you can see the track is still there, and it's unusual for any kind of a racetrack to last very long, like, untouched. Because again, it's so prime for development. I mean, it's flat land. There's a lot of trees there now, but it wouldn't be hard to flatten that out and put in a big box or something like that. Like I said, it is for sale, so it is going to be gone someday.
Excuse me, you said the trolley car barn. Is that the liquor store now?
Yes, it is. After Frank Jones died, I believe in 1892, a gentleman named Walter Cox bought the track. He was also a breeder, a reinsman, and he owned the track, obviously. And Granite State Park became part of what was called the Grand Circuit of Harness Racing, which still exists. At the time, it's a circuit around the country and actually into Canada. At the time of this racing, Detroit, Cleveland, Hartford, Connecticut, Atlanta, Poughkeepsie were all on the Grand Circuit, as well as Dover. And Dover was the only New England stop. It made it actually a pretty big deal in horse racing circles. Dover got to be pretty well known for that. A little side note, by the way, for a lot of friends from Somersworth want to help me on this book. Almost all of this park, this horse racing park, is in Somersworth. But that's the town that gets no respect. Everything is said to be in Dover, even though these things are in Somersworth. There's a hotel that used to exist. Actually, the building is still there. It gives its address as Dover, but it's actually in Somersworth. So Somersworth folks just don't quite get the respect that maybe they feel they need. But anyway, I thought this is from the Boston Globe in 1912, and it shows Walter Cox heading to Grand Rapids and this talking about his horses. So it was a pretty big deal. In 1912, Walter Cox added motorcycle racing to the Granite State Park, which to me was a pretty amazing thing. In 1912, motorcycles were still a fairly new technology. And yet here's Walter Cox, farsighted enough to say, we're going to have horse racing here, the sport of kings, but we're also going to have the newest technology in racing. Side by side, not literally, but sharing the same tracks. This picture, unfortunately, is not Granite State Park. There's one available, but again, the resolution wasn't good enough to put in the book. But it gives an idea of, I like the poster anyway, just because it kind of shows the feel of the park. My book is partly about having really interesting pictures, and I find this a really good picture of, this is the drivers that would have been racing at Granite State Park, or at Dover Speedway. This is taken in Sanford, Maine, but almost all of these gentlemen are from New Hampshire, except for one. And for example, this guy, I mean, he couldn't be more dressed to the T. Look at it, his hair is perfect. He's got a great jacket. His cuffs are perfect. He looks Hollywood. This guy, to me, looks like the three-letter man leaning against his locker in high school and just checking out the scene. This guy's named Cowboy Rivers. His family owned a camera shop, or he's of a family that owned a camera shop in Dover for a while. He was known as the wild man out there. That's his car, which sort of fits. But I guess if you didn't want to get in his way as a racer. But I just thought this was a great picture, and I just thought it was worthy putting in the book. A little bit more of urban archaeology. This is a picture from around 1950 at Dover Speedway. Cars coming down the front straight. I like the flat top on this guy, but that's not why the picture's here. But you can see here's the retaining wall on the front straight, and today part of that retaining wall is still there. And so that's the fascination of what's there, because there's still some remnants of those racetracks still existing. I don't know how long they'll be around, but they're there now. Different subject, Little Boar's Head in Northampton. My wife and I love driving up and down Ocean Boulevard, and we'd drive all the way from Rye down to Hampton and back, and we'd pass by these buildings and many others, and I just assumed they were cottages or bathhouses or something, but as it turns out, they're fish houses. They've been there since at least 1804, when they were referenced in a town council meeting. Little Boar's Head gets its name from a drumlin, which is a glacial hill that English surveyors named Little Boar's Head, spelled slightly differently, in the late 17th century. So one day we decided to stop and see what the deal was with these things, and there's a sign there besides this one that calls them the fish houses. But I still didn't know exactly what that meant, but I thought, well, it's more than just bathhouses, because it had a historical sign. The other interesting thing is where that woman is walking is what's called the King's Highway. Has anybody been down there and seen that? It's probably the oldest road in New Hampshire. Probably because it's a Native American pathway, but the oldest organized road in New Hampshire. By 1644, a road, the one where that woman is walking, existed along the seashore from Portsmouth to Hampton. In 1653, the Massachusetts Crown Commissioners ordered the building of a road from Kittery to Portland. So that completed the length from Boston all the way up to Portland, taking a ferry at Kittery. And then in 1664, King Charles II ordered a road built to link Boston to Charleston, South Carolina. This is the creation of the forerunner to US 1, the road that links Portland to, it eventually got to Savannah, and now it obviously goes down to Key West. It's been straightened and moved inland, but still this is the forerunner. And again, this road here from 1644 has got to be one of the oldest roads in the state. The name Kings Highway sounds high sounding, but Kings Highway just meant a road that was built by the Crown, not by private people such as the turnpikes were. There are still remnants of the Kings Highway left with the name still on it. And this doesn't come across. Oh, here it is. In Hampton, here's the Kings Highway. It's hard to see in this picture. This is Ocean Boulevard. Kings Highway is inland a little bit. And at Goose Rocks Beach, which is a part of Kennebunkport, there's a Kings Highway still exists along the waterfront. It goes quite a ways down that way. So the Kings Highway still does exist in certain places in its original position. These are the fish houses from the front. They were indeed, the purpose of them was for fishermen to store their equipment. I honestly, true confession to you, when I was thinking about my story about interesting, odd workers' homes like the shipbuilders' homes and the Grenier Heights homes, I thought, oh, I bet these are homes that fishermen must have lived in as they went out to ply their craft. But no, that's not the case. They were numbered 1 through 12 in the 90s by the National Register of Historic Places nomination form, just so they could identify them. One of these is too far back to be seen. Fish House 4 was the last one used for fishing, and that would be the fourth one from the left. It was until 1956. This is a undated picture from the Hampton Public Library. This is what the inside of a fish house would look like. And this is probably one of theirs. Hampton used to have 16. They have only 2 left. One's really only original. But you get an idea of the store all their equipment. These would be used sometimes by year-round fishermen, or they might be used by farmers who fished in the wintertime and had their equipment there. I also like in this picture, if you look carefully, there's a guy leaning against the door in the back, just checking out the scene and being part of the picture. Fish houses 9 and 10, the two on the right with the white rectangle, were the first to be used for purposes other than fishing by Melvina Hoffman, who converted them into a studio in the 1940s. I had not heard of Melvina Hoffman, but I had seen her work, as it turns out, because on the left is a sculpture she had done of Anna Pavlova, who was a friend of hers, and it was at the Detroit Institute of Arts, a place I visited often. I remember seeing this sculpture and admiring it, but not really paying attention to the name of the sculptor. She actually was quite accomplished. This is a sculpture at Harvard Memorial Church in Harvard Square. She was commissioned to do this in 1922 to honor the men of Harvard who died in the First World War. It can be visited. I went in and took this picture. The chapel's open, like good chapels are, almost all the time. You can just walk in and see it and reflect. She studied under Auguste Rodin, the gentleman who did The Thinker, and from Gutzon Borglum, the gentleman who did Mount Rushmore. So she studied under some big-time people, and she's quite accomplished. And again, this is a backstory. I wanted to learn about the fish houses, and I found out that Melvina Hoffman, who would summer in Little Boar's Head with her family, bought 2 of them in the 40s and turned them into studios for her art. Little Boar's Head, which they abbreviated LBH, was a summer colony for very well-to-do folks. They built what they called their summer cottages. These are a couple of the cottages. These happen to both be by the Studebaker family members. The white one on the top is at the south end. It's on a big curve in the road. You probably all passed by that a lot of times. The one on the bottom, another Studebaker mansion, is actually in Rye, just over the border, but it was still considered part of the colony. I put this picture in the book of the advertisement because it's a Studebaker, so it fit with this. But also I thought that even though this is clearly Hollywood or something like that, I think the fashions in this advertisement from 1929 would be exactly what you would expect the folks to be wearing at the summer colony during the 1920s and 30s. So it sort of reflected what I think the summer colony at Little Boar's Head would have been like. These are some of the folks who visited Little Boar's Head, some more than once. They would stay either with people they knew. There was a bachelor hotel there for a long time that many would stay at. Franklin Pierce eventually built a home there, which actually started the colony going because he built his home there, I think, in the 1850s or 60s, and from then on, that hotel was built and folks started building their summer homes there. Another backstory is a woman named Alice Hobson had a house there, and in the summertime she would have outdoor concerts on the lawn, sort of like Tanglewood. They would, sometimes as many as 2,500 people would attend these concerts. And in the summer of 1939, she had a special benefit concert given by the Boston Symphony Orchestra under the direction of Arthur Fiedler for the USS Squalus. Pay attention, by the way, that's a picture of the Squalus, to the bow, because it's going to lead to something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but what the bow of that submarine looks like. The Squalus in May of 1939 was a new submarine that was going out for sea trials. It was about 12 or 13 miles out by the Isle of Shoals. There was a dive order given. They started to dive, and then from the engine room, somebody shouted, "Take her up, the hatch is open." An induction hatch, which provided air and also provided oxygen for the machines, was left open, and the ship quickly flooded. 4 of the 7 compartments flooded. A couple of dozen sailors, unfortunately, lost their lives immediately, but 33 or so others survived in compartments that still had air. What made it difficult was it sunk to the bottom quickly, and it was in 240 feet of water. Up until that time, there had been no submarine rescue below a depth of 20 feet. So obviously, it was a dire situation. They knew that there were survivors because as the ship went down, it sent up a telephone line which worked for a few minutes. So they were able to communicate, but the line broke. The cleverness of the people, the naval people, the ships above dragged an anchor line across the Squalus, and they were able to tap out Morse code on the anchor chains, and they could still communicate with the ship below, giving them the status of what was going on. Two naval officers, Charles Momsen and Alan McCann, had been working on a diving bell at New London, but it hadn't been tested in a rescue situation. But the decision was made to bring it up from New London and see if we could make it work, because they didn't there was devices on board for people to escape from the ship underwater, but they didn't think they'd work from 200 feet. So they brought the bell, and as it turns out, everybody who survived was saved. This is a picture of the last person coming aboard to safety from the Squalus. So it was an event that was broadcast to the nation on radio-wide network. It was one of those situations where the whole country was listening to find out what was going to happen. It took 24 hours to get from New London to the Isles of Shoals to get in place, but the rescue was complete. So it was a wonderful rescue. The reason I mentioned Charles Momsen, and also the bow of the Squalus, is Momsen designed the albacore. Have any of you been to see the albacore in Portsmouth? It's really fun to go see. You can see my grandkids love it. I get a chance to put my grandkids in the picture. I love it. You can play with all the dials and everything. But what was different about the albacore, if you've driven by it, it has a snub nose, kind of an aerodynamic snub nose. Whereas remember the Squalus had an angled bow like ships that sail on the surface. It made subs much faster. It's really the prototype for subs even used today. It increased the speed and efficiency of subs. And Charles Momsen was the gentleman who devised the albacore. So it's worth a visit, especially if you got kids or grandkids. They will love it. It's got a nice little museum as well. Central Park. There was a Central Park in New Hampshire. It was in Dover and Somersworth, again, mostly in Somersworth. Picture on the cover of the book, and this is my favorite picture. That's why it's on the cover, and the editors thought the same thing. This is from around 1910 on a summer day at Central Park in New Hampshire. It was originally called Burgett Park. The guy who built it modestly named it after himself, but after a year they figured to give it a different name to show that it was central between Rochester, Dover, and what was then Great Falls, which is now Somersworth. But you can see, there's a lot of things here. The baseball field that I mentioned from the aerial photo is here. Here's the trolley barn. This is an 1890s one. The one that's there now was probably built around 1910. It had a casino, which is really a restaurant. It had, you could take boat rides on the lake. It was really a pretty big time park. Trolley parks were built by trolley companies as a way to drum up business on the weekend. They got all their money generally initially from taking workers to and from work, and they built these parks to get people to ride on the weekends. If you went to Central Park on the railroad, the Union Street Railroad, you got into the park for free. At one time there was over 1,000 trolley parks in the country. Coney Island is one. There's a great Seinfeld episode where Jerry's decides to go to Coney Island, and he rides the subway and he ends up there. There's just one guy in the train with him. If you've seen that episode, it's an interesting one. But anyway, Coney Island was a trolley park, in this case on the end of the subway. There's only 12 left in the country, trolley parks, meaning that they were designed around the trolley. Canopy Lake is one of them. It was a trolley park. The other, New Hampshire at one time had 4. Besides Central Park, there was Pine Island in Manchester, Kentucky in Concord, and Canopy Lake. The trolley that went by the park was initially owned by Mary Dow. This is another backstory in my book. She, in 1889, was a minority holder in the Dover Horse Railway. That's an example of a horse railway, but that's on the Isle of Man. That's obviously none in the United States, but that gives you an idea what they look like. She gained a majority of the stock and was appointed president. It was a world first. There had never been, she was the first woman in the world to own a railroad, and that was a big deal. Even though it was a 6-mile horse railroad, it put her in the league with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Leland Stanford. She became world famous. She was presented to Congress. She met President Cleveland. Under her leadership, the stock in the company rose from $7 to $100 per share. She was born on a farm, so she bought and took care of the horses. She was remarkable in many ways. Before her marriage, she was a professional stage actress in St. Louis. She moved back to Dover, became an assistant principal in Rochester. In 1887, she successfully demanded the right to vote in Dover 33 years before the 19th Amendment. She probably is the first woman to vote in New Hampshire. I Googled one day, first woman to vote in New Hampshire, and it lists somebody, I forget the name, but it was somebody in 1920, which is logical. They probably figured out who would have been the first woman to vote after the 19th Amendment. They found this person and assumed that was the first person to vote. But if she voted, and I'd have to do more research, because this shows that she registered. But I got to believe someone like her, if she registered, she voted. It was probably in the mayoral election. But still, she was a remarkable woman. She was in a lot of media. The magazine on the left is a trade magazine, front page article about her. The magazine on the right is a ladies' book. And this is an excerpt from the article about her. And I love not only to talk about her being the president, at this point the ex-president of the Dover Railway, Horse Railway, but they describe her as a woman of medium height, dark gray blue eyes, straight nose, brows arched, wears her brown hair in a pompadour. It's interesting to see this basically pretty, hard-charging businesswoman described in a women's magazine thus. I like at the bottom, not only a model wife, but she's also a crack shot and a bold swimmer. She was quite a Renaissance person. In my book, I mentioned more of what she's done. She really was an amazing person. And as a backstory, I was glad to put in, her only connection again is she owned the railway that Burgett bought to build Central Park. Central Park itself, this is a postcard from around 1900. The top picture is the casino, which was really a restaurant and dance hall. Here's a bear cage, and yes, the park had a bear cage for some strange reason. And then here is a rock garden, and I'll show you another picture of that later. Another backstory in my book, as I mentioned, is the Eagle Scouts. An Eagle Scout named David Brackett made his Eagle project to restore the bear cage. He was only 13, which is pretty young for an Eagle Scout to be doing that. So that's the restored bear cage. In another section of the park, you can see those foundations for the pillars of the casino. So there's still a few remnants left. There's William Pond right there. David Brackett, the rock garden that I mentioned that I showed in the photograph in the upper left is what it looked like when he started the project, and he's restored it beautifully to what it was in 1890. He's also added, as you can see, some signs explaining what the park was like. It's a wonderful exhibit. It's a beautiful park anyway. You can walk all the way around it if anybody has. You can park either in Somersworth or you can park in Dover and walk around it. We take our dogs there and you'll see people walking. It's quiet. My wife and I one day saw a bald eagle flying over. It's a nice little oasis. Actually, there's another part of it where another eagle had also improved part of the park. All that's left of the name Central Park is a garage across the street. Actually, the gentleman who owns that garage is the one who told me how to find the racetrack. And then, as the gentleman in the back mentioned, the liquor store. That's the old trolley barn. And that was for the longest time, it was an auto repair shop. The reason I included this picture in is I think this is a wonderful example of preservation. You can see they've respected the building. On the left side where windows would be, obviously you're not going to want to have windows in a liquor store, I like the white and things they placed in there. The entrances where the trolleys would go in have been made in white. If you go inside, the initial plan was to put in a drop ceiling, but the persons who were running the project decided if you looked in the ceiling, as you can now, all the infrastructure from the trolley days are still there. Some of the pulleys and other works for there. So it's an incredible building. It's a great example of preservation. And also, if you're looking for that Christmas present for that hard-to-buy-for person, there is a $1,000 bottle of scotch and a $3,000 bottle of cognac for sale in there. So you can do your Christmas shopping all in one place. But right behind that is Central Park. Just to the left, there's a road that drives into there. If you keep going, you can drive and you can park and you can visit Central Park and the work of the Eagle Scout. Back here in town, town pounds, strays, meaning stray animals, reeves, that's a hog reeve, I'll explain that in a minute. Pounders is another word for pound keepers, the gentlemen or ladies who kept the pound. This is a picture of the Durham town pound. I put it in my book, even though I could have used a photograph. This is from a 1923 book by Walter Nutting called New Hampshire Beautiful. It's a really nice book. He goes around the state. He did his own artwork, and he describes beautiful things to see. You can see it really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot. Obviously, that barn is not there, but the gate and the pound are virtually the same. It is the oldest pound in the state, but it means it's the oldest established pound. It was established in 1708. But it was built of wood for the first 100 years. And in 1808, the stone one was built and was restored in 1908 or 1909. But it's still the oldest town pound in the state, which is why I start the story here. This is a picture from the inside. I doubt if any of you have been inside, so I've gone in there for you to see what it looks like. My dog is looking in, and again, thinking better him in the pound than me. The town has done a beautiful job, I think, since that picture was taken, of making this corner a little bit more pleasant. But you can go in it, and it's kind of interesting. You know, it's kept very nicely, but it's interesting to go inside and have a look. In terms of hog reeves, I don't know if anybody remembered about a month and a half ago, there was a story going around about a bunch of pigs were loose in Vermont. Did anybody see that? It was online for a while. I think it even made it on MUR one night. Dozens of hogs got loose somewhere in Vermont. This is what a hog reeve's job would have been a long time ago. Hogs, if they got loose, would tend to do a lot of damage, so that's why you had a specific person to gather up the hogs and take them to the pound. So this town could have used a hog reeve. They did eventually get them up, but this illustrates the hog reeve job perfectly. Hogs on the loose. Town pounds originally began in England. They were sometimes called pinfolds. This one's in a village called Heworth, England, around 1890. Again, unfortunately, this picture, the resolution isn't good enough to use because I love the picture because you can see the people are posing in the pound with their animals. Why? I have no idea. It could be because it's located next to the Wheat Chief Inn, which is a pub. But I think it's a great picture. I love the police officer looking on, just a little bit bemused, I think, by what's going on inside there. But it's a great picture, and I like showing it here. I wish I could have put it in the book. Unfortunately, this pound is gone. It's replaced, the railroad went through it. The construction of a pound was one of the first civic acts in any new colonial town. A good example, I mean, Durham is one of the oldest towns, so that doesn't apply so much, but a good example is a pound I'm going to talk about in a minute, the Derryfield Pound in Manchester. Manchester used to be part of Derry. It sort of became quasi-independent. It called itself Derryfield for a long time. And before it was incorporated into town, they realized they needed to have a pound because that was that important of a thing for towns to have. It controlled animal behavior. Animals would get loose. They'd either need to be rounded up and given back to the owner or rounded up so they didn't do damage. And so it was really a really early part of a town's founding was building a pound. They were used for impounding animals or overdue taxes. If you didn't pay your taxes, they could impound your animals and you'd have to pay your taxes and then pay the fees, and the pound keepers would get a fee for keeping the animal. This one is in Sandown. It's from 1793. This is an example of when I was on my job as a teacher consultant driving around to different districts. One day I was driving the back road home from Plastow, and I went up this road and I saw this, there's the old town pound right there. It's kind of off the beaten track. This newspaper article from Tasmania in 1884 was the only example I could find of how the pound system worked. And it's a pound notice, impounded at the above pound, one red and white heifer, white face, red spot below the forehead, horns, age about 3, no brands visible. Damages claimed 10 shillings, which is a half a pound. So whoever found the animal, whoever property the animal damaged, maybe crops or something, the person who owned that cow owed 10 shillings to that person, and the poundage fee, food and water, were 1 shilling 6 pence a day. 10 shillings, half a pound is about $2.50 in American money at that time. So $2.50 in 1884 would have been a big chunk of change. The poundage fee of 1 shilling 6 pence is about 38 cents a day. Again, this is 1884, so that was a decent chunk of change as well that the person would have to come up with. And then if the animal wasn't claimed, he'd be sold at auction. Another back story, David Haynes, I read, was at age 19, was convicted of stealing cloth in England. He was transported to Australia, sentenced to 7 years. After 6 years, he finished his sentence. He stayed there. He became pound keeper and became town jailer. So it's a good example of how, quick little vignette of the system of transporting prisoners from England and Australia's growth and how it came to be the nation that it is, that a lot of these people just stayed there and made good, like David Haynes did. The strangest looking town pound is the Derryfield Pound, which I mentioned. Has anybody ever seen this? If you've been to the cross-country meets, yeah, so did I. I did the cartoon double take the day I drove by that. I was working at Southside Middle School. I had to go to a meeting at Hillside. If you see the crossing sign, the yellow sign on the left, it shows that Hillside is just beyond, and I looked over and I go, what the heck is that? It's the town pound gate. This goes back also the backstory of the DAR. I believe this gate is only here today because of the DAR. On the top, it shows what the pound looked like around 1900. The walls were high. If you look at the pillars, there's nothing on top. You can just see right where about the TER in Manchester is where the plinth on top would have been. In 1976, the pound was significantly deteriorated, but you can still identify it as a pound. You can see the plinth is on top. In 1976, not long after this, or maybe 77, the Manchester Town Fathers thought they needed to get rid of the stones because of vandalism. I can't imagine middle school kids throwing those rocks very easily. My theory is they really just wanted to make it easy to cut the grass. But whatever the reason was, my theory is that that gate exists only because that plinth on the top, it reads Town Pound. It's an 1841 in Roman numerals, Molly Stark chapter of the DAR 1916. I think the Town Fathers weren't even about to take down a DAR monument, much as they probably wanted to. And I think that's what saved that gate, which looks like something out of the Twilight Zone or a Star Trek episode. It is, interestingly enough, the only town pound that has a function. Every other town pound in the state is a lovely thing to visit, but it's not doing anything other than sitting there. Here it is right here. This is a middle school cross-country meet from a year or two ago. They hold them in the fall. And in the official rules, you're told, the runners are told, when you get to the town pound gate, you go left and then head toward the finish line. So this is the only town pound that still provides a function, even though it has nothing to do with keeping animals anymore. Meeting house at Dover Point. This is something I drove by a lot. When we moved here 15 years ago, we'd go to Tuttle's a lot. Now it's Tendercrop, but we drive down Dover Point Road. I bet many of you have driven by this if you've headed down Dover Point Road. I'd seen that sign, historic site, First Parish Church in Dover, erected here in 1854, which is also not quite accurate. The First Parish Church is the name of the church, but it makes it sound like the First Parish Church was built there. The first church was built maybe a half mile away. Nobody knows exactly where, but they have a general idea. But what's important about this, and I got out one day and looked, you can see the ground is raised. There's a depression here, and the ground is raised there. These are the remains of a fortification. This is the only meeting house that I have found in the country, in America, that had a fort built around it. This gives you a little bit different idea, a better idea of what we're looking at. This is from a 1940 War Department photo. This is where Edward Hilton landed, first gentleman to settle the state in his group. They landed at Pomeroy Cove, set up his settlement there. The first meeting house is roughly here. That's probably where they figure where the toll house on the Spalding is now. The second meeting house, the one we just showed, is right there. It's Dover Point Road. Spalding was basically built on the line of an old railway. One of the interesting things about early Dover days, Dover was founded in 1623. And for 10 years, just Edward Hilton and his fishing party lived there. In 1633, a bunch of folks from Boston moved up, some Puritans, some others who thought it was too strict there. So for the next 9 years, they went through 5 preachers. The chapter in the book is called Preacher Wars, and it's really true. Thomas Larkham knocked the hat off of this guy's head. This guy, at a confrontation, was armed with a gun. These are 2 men of God. They're both Cambridge grads, so you'd think they would have some education about them. Part of the party they went with, Reverend Hansford Nollis, took a halberd, which is those big pikes like the Swiss Guards use. It's a big spear with an axe on it. He attached a Bible to it, and he must have thought that was an appropriate use of the Bible to put it on a major weapon and to go into this confrontation. The good news is cooler heads prevailed. No shots were fired. Both sides got fined money, and they kind of went their separate ways. And after 9 years, finally, the conflict between different factions wanting different preachers in Dover settled down, and they settled into one preacher from there on. Both these gentlemen went back to England again and had very successful lives. Here, though, is the only picture of what that fortified meeting house would have looked like, or what it is thought to have looked like. This is from a picture from around 1884. Here's where Dover Point Road would be. I don't know why it's not on this picture because it was there. So here's where that sign is, and here's the front. Here's where that depression was. This is a guard tower. They call them sconces as well. And here's where the wall continued. And then it goes up that way and that way around. So those foundations still exist. And those foundations are from 1667. And it's pretty amazing that they've lasted all these years. Because it's in a busy area, there's a fair amount of building around there, but they're still there. They can still be viewed. There's actually an archaeological dig done in the last couple summers, and they have found the clay floor of the meeting house, so that's pretty exciting. But again, it's the only meeting house that had a fort built around it. The irony is, even though for 75 years there was a lot of skirmishes with the local Native Americans in Dover and here, as you know, and nearby, down there they had never had any trouble with the Native Americans, even though this was built for that purpose. In 1983, the church, for placing this land on the National Register of Historic Places, had an archaeological examination done. So I just, in the book, I think you can see it pretty clearly from here. On the left, you can see the wall that corresponds to the left picture of that diagram, and you can see the depression in the snow up there corresponds to the depression in the upper left. So that's where another sconce or tower would have been. Dover Point Road is on the right side. Then in this picture, maybe a little bit harder to make out, is lined up such that we are looking at this. This here is looking here down. And then this here is looking across. And again, it's the entire foundations of the Palisades are still there after, 360 some years. Another little DAR thing. In 1902, the DAR had this built. And I think the timing was probably pretty good because obviously there weren't a whole lot of cars around then. Probably Dearborn wagons were still driving by. But I think having built that, as opposed to just having a gradual slope down to the road, probably helped save these foundations because now they're protected from the road, from cars, from traffic, from everything else. So I doubt if that was their intention, but I think they wanted to beautify and to show that those are there. This is from the local DAR chapter. London Bridge, not in London, not a bridge. This is when I was working as a consultant. I worked with the Windham School District. They were building a $44 million high school. I read a Boston Globe article at the same time I was working with people there. The article says, 1799 bridge divides New Hampshire town on past versus present. Landmark Snarls School Project. I went into a meeting with some people in Windham to talk about this. This was about special ed issues, but I said, hey, did you guys hear about the bridge that's holding up the school? And they pretty much bit my head off. Yeah, we've heard about the bridge that's holding up the school. And a good friend of mine said, I can't believe they're going to hold up the whole project for a pile of rocks. Because it was going to delay the school opening. They needed a school. They had been sending their kids to Salem and paying tuition to send them there, spending millions a year. So they needed a new school, and this was going to delay it. This was the point of contention. It's actually not a bridge, it's a causeway. A causeway is different in that bridges are built on pillars with a roadway. Causeways are just filled in, but it is a construction. It's dry stone construction, which is very sturdy. It was built in 1799. In 2005, as the plans were being publicized for the school, it turned out that the school wanted to build an access road from London Bridge Road, which still exists, and it was going to go right through that. The Historic District Commission got involved, and fortunately, a hunter who hunted there had a friend on the Historic Commission and said, hey, do you know there's something out in the woods there? And so he took them out there, and this is what they found out there. They realized it was significant. The Federal Highway Administration has an act that says if you're going to build a road, you have to take historical considerations in mind, and therefore it stopped the project. And hence my friend being mad about the pile of rocks stopping the school. Eventually, the state found for them. There's only 4 causeways in the state that are left, which is one reason why that one, the London Bridge one, was important. This one's in Kensington on Dearborn Road, no relation to our general. But probably the same family. But this is a good example of another causeway. You can see that they're quite a construction project. It's not something done lightly. It was a major undertaking for a town. There's 2 others in Wilton and Canterbury. The National Register of Historic Places report said it's a rare intact, about London Bridge, and there's the roadway, a rare intact example of an early road, well-preserved example of late 18th to early 19th century road construction, relatively uncommon in that most causeways were constructed of logs, rock, and earth. This one is entirely built of rock, and it has stood to this day. It's 200 years old, 220 years old. So the historic district beat the school district 1-0, and the London Bridge stayed. If you see in the upper right of the picture, you can see the guardrails for the access road to the high school. That's where it goes now. They did avoid it. It was significant The state's founded because of its history is engineering, its potential for important information about construction of these structures. This is the state architectural historian. So it stood. Another Eagle side story. While the school was being built and the London Bridge had been saved, it had been sort of cordoned off with that orange plastic fencing that they throw up. And his name is Nick Letizia. His family owns a large food distributorship in Windham. He said he looked at that and he said the bridge wasn't being respected at all. There was just trash in there. So he made it his Eagle project to improve it. And so you can see he did a great job. He cleaned up the area around the bridge. He installed a little patio. He installed those two benches. One of them says London Bridge 1799, so people can go and reflect and enjoy it. Unfortunately, I think the school district is not happy about it. I went out there a couple weeks ago to take a picture, and you basically can't see it. They've completely left the weeds grow up. So I don't know what's going to happen there. The local historic society wants to get a historical marker there, and hope maybe that'll shame the school district into taking care of it. As a former high school teacher, I'm thinking the National Honor Society or student government, the kids would be thrilled to take an afternoon off of school and to go fix that thing up. It'd be sort of a no-brainer. Another nice thing, though, even the high school doesn't respect it. Windham Center School has a tradition where they build a mural. The class that leaves the school each year, the fifth graders, build a mural about the town. This one is about London Bridge. Few problems. That's not a causeway. There's no water running under it, and there's mountains behind it, and there's none of those in Windham that I know of. But having said that, I like that these students decided to honor London Bridge by making this mural, and it's there. And even though the high school, where it ought to be honored, I think, as far as I know, says nothing about it, Windham Center Schools decided to honor it. In conclusion, I'm still looking for interesting historical sites around the state. I knew about this bridge that had been, are you familiar with the story of this bridge? It was the span in the middle of 243 feet. At the time, was the biggest span in the world. This is a significant bridge. Unfortunately, the ice took it away, I think, in 1853. And I couldn't make it a story, even though there's a lot to it, because there's nothing to attach it to today. Until recently, when I was given a presentation in Madbury, and a woman the road that goes down to the bridge, Dover Point Road, is Back River Road. It's Back River Road. In Madbury, for a mile, it's called something else, and it's Back River Road again when it's here in Durham. Anyway, she lives in Madbury. She said there's a milestone near here, and so she took me to see it. And it's hard to read. Well, what it says is, I went there just a few weeks ago. It says bridge 1 mile, meaning the old bridge, and then Dover 4 miles. So there is the connector to that bridge. And had I even had that little anchor, I probably would have been able to write a story about it, because that bridge is a great story. But I'm always looking for things in the state, and this is one. Like, I drive up and down that road all the time, but I'd passed by that a bunch of times. I hadn't noticed it until it was pointed out, and there's something, connecting the bridge that was a remarkable feat of construction and to today.
Is that the bridge that went over to Newington?
It's where there's a historical marker there. It went to Newington, yeah. And what's that? Is it called? It's called Cedar Point Road.
If you go to Cedar Point,
Yeah.
there's you can still see a bunch of rocks where the bridge was on the Durham side.
Yeah.
And then it would go over to Goat Island and
Right.
then over
Yeah.
to Newington.
Yeah, you can see it on Newington side too, like there's abutments.
Yeah, you can see so there's a little bit there, but having seen this historical marker, this milestone, really to me brought it back to almost today, because here's something put up that definitely mentions the bridge that was once there and is a reminder of that bridge.
Well, that would explain why it's 4 miles to Dover, because you have to go through Newington to come back to Dover.
Yeah,
Even though you were
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well,
Dover
yeah.
Point, I guess.
Yeah, this is actually on, this marker is probably in Dover. It could be Madbury, it could be Dover, right on the line. And you go up past the Sawyer Mills. I think when they meant in 1855, when they meant Dover, they probably meant the town center. because technically this milestone, I believe, is in the town of Dover, but I think they meant the town center, which in 1855, not even the big mills were there. Anyway, so I thought that was a fitting way to end this, because I would have loved to have done a story about that bridge. Maybe someday I will, but at least I found out, like I said, just a month ago, literally, that this existed. And so that's it, unless you want to hear more about the big tire. Thank you. I guarantee you Tom Brady could not have missed that tire, because the bus from the airport to the Allen